Hi there, and a very warm welcome to Season 6, Episode 12 of People Soup. It's Ross McIntosh here.
But if you were switched at birth and raised by a drug cartel boss, you probably wouldn't be sitting here talking compassion with me. You would be a very different, probably much more violent, and your face would have tattoos all over them, and you would be probably a version of you that this version of you probably wouldn't like very much. But again, we don't choose the person that we've become. Now we can wake up and get off autopilot more. We have some say in who we can become.
In this episode, I continue my chat with Dr. Eric Goodman, and we dive into his new book, The Mindful Freakout, a rescue manual for being at your best when life is at its worst. The ingredients Eric brings to People's Soup are a beautiful blend of acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, and compassion-focused therapy, CFT. Eric shares the origin story of the book and presents his accessible and useful quick start guide. We also chat about the fears, blocks and resistances to compassion, and you'll find out what the acronym AFGO stands for. For those of you who are new to People's Soup, welcome. It's great to have you here. We aim to provide you with the ingredients for a better work life, from behavioural science and beyond. For those of you who are regular Pea Soupers, thanks for tuning in again. We love it that you're part of our community. A quick scoot over to the news desk. I'd love it if you checked out my new website at rossmcintosh.co.uk, and if you sign up for my occasional newsletter, you'll be sure to receive the first one, which will go out before Christmas. For those of you who spotted that there was no episode last week, alas, I lost my voice, so I couldn't record an intro. But I'm back on form this week and recording this from the Mespil Hotel in Dublin, which I'd highly recommend. So let's crack on. For now, get a brew on and have a listen to the second part of my chat with Eric Goodman. So Eric, I'd like to turn to your book, The Mindful Freakout, a rescue manual for being at your best when life is at its worst. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading the book over the last... I read it and then I dipped back into it for certain areas and chapters and practices. So let me start with my review.
Can I just say that's really my intention for people to do that with this book. It was written to be somewhat of a reference in challenging times. That isn't, I didn't have the expectation that people will necessarily all read it page to page, cover to cover, but be able to kind of start with the that quick start guide, and then get help immediately, and then whichever areas they're struggling with in particular, they can go and do a deeper dive into those skills.
Absolutely, and you've mentioned one of the features of the book. It's like when you get a new phone, a new television, you do have a quick start guide in Eric's book, which is fabulous. But let me just share with you my review, and then we'll dive in a bit further. As Billy Ocean once said, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. However, there are different ways that we can get going. As humans, many of us might respond to distressing moments on our emotional autopilot, those well-worn habitual responses where we might blow our tops, spiral out of control, or freak out. I'd recommend this book as a practical and illuminating manual for those who would like to explore a different response to life's challenging moments. Eric brings together his decades of practice and experience to guide us through the development of an alternative response, blending ACT and CFT in a beautifully accessible and human way, helping us to build our own workable actions when life is at its worst. I found this book extremely useful, both for myself and to inform my work with clients. Thank you, Eric, for showing us that the tough can get going in an entirely different, more effective and compassionate way. Bravo.
Thank you so much.
I'd love to know more about your creative approach. When were the seeds planted for writing this book?
Well, I was pre-COVID. I was toying with the idea of writing a book for people having panic attacks. It's a big part of my practice is working with people who are experiencing panic attacks for a number of reasons. And that was kind of in my back burner, kind of playing around with different concepts for that. And then the world changed with the COVID lockdown, and daily on the news out here, and I'm curious if you had that same experience where you were. We were seeing people kind of losing their cool in very public sorts of ways. So people screaming at each other about masks in grocery stores, people fighting on airplanes, people just seeming to be driven by their threat systems. And, people causing a scene on an airplane and then getting publicly dragged off the plane, and then later when they were interviewed saying, please don't judge me based on the worst day I ever had in my life. I felt this sense of compassion for people who were losing their cool. The people who were even doing some really awful stuff like starting fights on airplanes and screaming about masks in grocery stores. I looked at that as their threat systems were just driving the bus, and that they were being swept along for the ride. And who among us hasn't had their threat system take over and have them do things that they later regret? So if you've ever gotten into, a heated argument with a loved one, that's the threat system is driving that bus. Because if you're having a heated argument with someone, what's your goal? I mean, if your goal is to persuade, that's the worst possible thing you could do. If your goal, if it's a loved one, like say a romantic partner, and you're having a heated argument with them, if your goal is to have this deep, loving connection with this person, that's probably not a strategy that you would pick. And so, our threat systems, they're designed to take us over, almost like we're being possessed. And there's very adaptive reasons for that. So if you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, you want your threat system to just flood you with energy and dread and just make your body run from the situation as quickly as you can, right? Think how maladaptive it would be if you're being chased by the saber-toothed tiger and you need to stop to make a pro and con list. What's the pros of me running? What's the cons? Should I climb a tree? What's the pros? What's the cons? You get eaten every time, right? And so we have threat systems that are designed to take over. And in certain situations, that's helpful. If you're driving on the highway and the car in front of you slams on its brakes suddenly, you need your threat system to put your foot on the brake and press it down before you've even registered consciously what's going on, right? So it's important. But the problem is when it's a misperceived threat and we're being driven by our threat system to behave in primitive sorts of ways, we're going to end up doing things that we wouldn't choose to do and that we regret. Now, it doesn't make sense to beat ourselves up for that because you are locked out of the controls. But if you want to, meet challenging moments in a way that is helpful, not harmful, and in ways that eases your suffering and allows you to choose how to respond in a way that's based on your values, not your threat emotions. That's what I wrote this book for.
Wonderful. And you mentioned earlier the quick start guide. So if someone's listening to this thinking, oh gosh, I'd be really interested in in reading Eric's book. Maybe just describe how we can begin to make those changes. Talk to us a little bit about the quick start guide.
Yeah. So, my thought with this book, and sometimes I'll give it to clients that are struggling with things like panic attacks, or sometimes they're struggling for whatever thoughts come to their head, like an OCD, or with kind of a wide variety of threats. And I'll give them that and just tell them, when you feel like you're really struggling, just look at this quick start guide, because it kind of walks you through steps for how to deal with these moments in a way that you're not going to regret, and that will likely ease your suffering more than if you're just on autopilot. So, it's a very much a compassion focused ACT approach. That step number one is you have to get off autopilot. And, ACT's been talking about this for years, but I'm not sure that they've really emphasized that this is one of the most crucial things in mental health, that if we're driven on autopilot, we're locked out. And so we have to take control back over our own actions and reactions. And so being able to recognize when you're dealing with a really challenging moment, just kind of taking a few seconds, just calling a little time out, and you're saying, all right, let me handle this in a way that's going to be helpful, not harmful. And so you're setting this compassionate intention right from the start, and then doing kind of mindfulness sorts of approaches, and breathing approaches, being able to ground yourself in the moment, because when we're under threat, our minds are very often racing to the past or the future, like what's going to happen, what's going to happen. Well, let's come back to right here, right now, right? Maybe you're just sitting in a chair in your office. Just feel what it feels like to sit in that chair. Look around you. All right, come back to this moment here. Notice that you're holding your breath, and just let that breath come and go more naturally. Maybe even prolong that exhale so that you get that sympathetic nervous system woken up. Then once we have choice, once we've gotten off autopilot, then we need to do something that kind of runs counter to our instincts, and that is we got to turn towards what's difficult, right? Because when people are feeling painful feelings now, people are so accustomed to running from their experience. They pull out their phone and they start going through YouTube, right? They're running from their feelings. And when you run from your feelings again and again and again, you get worse and worse and worse about how do you feel feelings adaptively. And one thing about human life is it's chock full of painful feelings. And so we better get good at handling them, right? Because they're not going to stop. And one of the themes across everything I've written is, and I guess that's what I get from ACT, and that is any time you've ever heard things about becoming anxiety free or anger free, or free from grief or whatever, those are always been marketing hype. It's never been an option. Humans experience painful emotions. That's kind of our thing. And so we want to be able to experience it. Now we can experience it in a way that is a battle, a struggle. Like when I talked about getting into the cold water, you can go to war with that cold and you're going to feel worse. You can go to war with your feeling of anxiety, anger, sadness, and you're going to feel worse. Or you can take a moment, stop, and try to engage that compassion system, that thing that got me through that really dark moment of my life. Right? So you can switch on that part of you that lets you have that sense of inner strength wisdom to not judge, and this commitment to doing what's helpful. And there's a lot of different strategies for doing that. And then just some of the practical act stuff like diffusion, right? So when I see, somebody cuts me off in traffic and I experience the thought, I need to teach that person a lesson. Being able to see that, that's a thought that got activated. That was an algorithm that got, pushed, that is happening. But it isn't you, and you don't have to choose. You don't have to hook on it if you don't choose to do so, right? If you're off autopilot. And then notice where you're struggling. And one of the, I think, single best strategies for therapy is just check in with your body and see, where are you at war with your emotion? Are you gritting your teeth? Are you hunching your shoulders? Are you balling up your fists? Are you fidgeting with your feet? Right? All things that are about experiential avoidance. I don't want to feel this thing, so I'm tightening up, I'm bracing. But when we do that, we're further teaching our nervous system that this moment is threatening, right? If you're in combat, if you're about to get into a fist fight with someone, you want to tighten your body, you want to constrict your breathing, you want to, squeeze your stomach, because it's going to give you the best chance to deal with that actual threat. But when you're doing that because you got a work deadline coming up, you're just creating more suffering for no good reason. And then lastly, so we kind of get off autopilot, we turn towards our experience rather than running from it. And then we think for a moment, right? How do I feel like handling this situation? Right? Well, maybe you're having an argument with your partner, and you feel like insulting their mother or something like that, right? You feel like you want to teach them a lesson. Then you stop and say, all right, well, if I was at my absolute best, what would I want to do? How would I want to deal with this? And then that gives you that values-based goal to work towards.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Eric. So, listeners, if that hasn't convinced you to go and explore this book, I'm not sure what will. But that's so beautifully brought to life, Eric. And I love the whole book, in case you hadn't gathered. And my two favourite chapters, the ones I've been revisiting, are Chapter 7, Compassionate Mind Training, and Chapter 11, Choosing Your Best Self-Response. And the whole book is so practical. Tell us more about your approach. How did you craft this to make it so practical?
Well, I spent some time trying to figure out just this model of integrating compassion-focused therapy in ACT. And what I've noticed is that more and more, this is what ACT people are doing. And even when you and I were speaking earlier, you as an ACT person, you've been incorporating more and more compassion work. And we do this because they just go really well together. I happen to think compassion should be part of ACT, but they didn't ask for my vote on that. So when people are under threat, they need things made very simple in the moment, right? So all right, take a time out, get off autopilot, turn towards what you feel, and take wise action based on who you want to be. So I think about like my clients who are most distressed, and those are people who are having frequent panic attacks. And when they're having a panic attack, they need some simple sorts of ways of dealing with it. And what people who are experiencing something like panic disorder, they tend to do the worst possible things you can do in the face of a panic attack, which is to struggle with it, fight it, hate it, and beat yourself up over having it. And so there's another way to approach it that is going to be more effective with less suffering.
Absolutely. And there was a four-letter acronym in the book that I enjoyed. It tickled me, and it was AFGO.
Is that the first time you heard that acronym?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been around for a while. This was a supervisor of mine back in grad school who gave me that acronym. So AFGO, AFGO, stands for Another Freeing Growth Opportunity. Well, that's the PG version. It's actually meant to be another fucking growth opportunity. And so what that means is that when life throws challenges our way, there is the opportunity to make things worse. So there's the opportunity to grow from them. Doesn't mean we like them or want them, right? And that's what ACT talks about with this sense of willingness. But the willingness for the reality of the moment to be the reality of the moment and to use this situation in a way that hopefully will end up beneficial for you in the long term. So if you are having that argument with your partner, you use that as a way to deepen the connection rather than teach them a lesson. But you can only do that if you're not on autopilot, right? Or if you are anxious socially and you've been invited to a party where you don't know a lot of people and you can avoid it, or you can go and you can tighten up and constrict and maybe listen to what your anxiety says, which is to go sit in a corner quietly somewhere by yourself. Or you can use it as a growth opportunity to say, look, I'm going to go and I'm going to meet 3 people. And I'm going to get out of my head as far as thinking about my performance at this party and worrying about what other people think. And I'm going to really focus on the people I'm talking to and trying to find them interesting and trying to see them as a fellow human that I can care about, right? And then you have a different experience.
And I used exactly that strategy recently at a networking event for psychologists in Seville. And I was having all sorts of thoughts that my Spanish isn't good enough, and felt a great urge to just run once I'd arrived. But I'd actually used your strategies and decided, look, if I speak to 3 people, that will be a pretty big achievement for me. So just focus on that and just look around the room before the event started, and noticing that everyone was on autopilot looking at their phones. Not everyone. There were some little cliques of people who obviously knew each other already and were delighted to see each other, but there were a fair few people around the room looking slightly wallflower-like and just staring at their phones. So I approached one of them and started a conversation, and it was fine.
Yeah.
I could make myself understood. They were very kind, and we had a lovely conversation, and we're still in touch. So
Oh, that's fantastic. And then you can take it even one step further. And that is, no matter how it goes, that you're going to be a supporter of you. If it goes great, you're going to pat yourself on the back and say, hey, you did this hard thing, good for you. If it goes terribly, you go and you can't get the words out and people laugh at you or whatever, which of course wouldn't happen. People imagine that would happen. And if that were to happen, you're going to be the best friend to yourself, and you're going to say, that was really, really unpleasant. That was really difficult, but you got through it, and we'll get it next time, right? But a lot of people, they're going to get more stuck in kind of beating themselves up afterwards, because they have this false notion that if you beat yourself up, you're going to do better next time. And it just isn't the case.
absolutely. Now, Eric, how are people responding to your book? How are they feeding back to you on how useful it is, your clients, others?
So the most of the feedback I get is from my clients, because they're the ones that are reading it and working through the exercises with me. And the vast majority of them Once they understand what compassion is, they really they like it, and they find it immensely useful, and they see how well it helps ease their suffering. And then there are people who deal with fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion, and they either just don't understand why someone would do this thing, and that typically because they just haven't, a client now who just, was raised by cold narcissistic parents that showed them no compassion. And so then they grow up and they don't really understand it because they didn't experience it. If you've experienced it, you can get how it is, right? You can understand that when your child is suffering, being warm and kind and encouraging is better than berating them, right? And if it's good for them, if you have that innate wisdom to understand it's good for others, understand you're no different. If it's good for them, it's good for you.
Amen. Eric, it's great to hear your book is getting a positive response from your clients, and I'd love to add my enthusiasm to their feedback and recommend it for people in the workplace. You've been so generous with sharing insights and tips with us. I wonder if there's one more you'd be willing to share as a takeaway for our listeners on maybe slightly with a work spin on it.
Well, in most workplaces, there is going to be at least one person there who is difficult to deal with. And there's the joke that if there isn't one, you're that person, right? But everyone really deals with difficult people in an organization, and if you approach them as the other, as the asshole or whatever, being in their presence is going to activate a threat reaction. And given that you're going to spend potentially more time with them than you are with your own family, wouldn't you want to have a different sort of reaction when you're around them? And so being able to see them as whatever made them difficult, they didn't choose it. They're not making that choice to be difficult. That got coded into them somewhere along the ways, right? And if you were raised by their parents and you had their life experiences and their genetics, they would be you. You would be them, right? Absolutely. And so when you can recognize that they're trying to do the best that they can with what life coded into them, right? They're not intentionally the way they are, right? None of us are, right? And here you are with this podcast and you do this act work. But if you were switched at birth and raised by a drug cartel boss, you probably wouldn't be sitting here talking compassion with me. You would be a very different, probably much more violent, and your face would have tattoos all over them, and you would be probably a version of you that this version of you probably wouldn't like very much. But again, we don't choose the person that we've become. Now we can wake up and get off autopilot more. We have some say in who we can become. So when you have this difficult person at work, being able to see them with compassion so that when you see them, it's not the threat system. You're not getting dumped with cortisol day in, day out around this person, but you're able to activate other feelings that are going to be come with less suffering, and they'll be more adaptive for you.
Really, really powerful takeaway, Eric. I'm sure we can all think about that person, and frankly, whether it's in work, but also out of work as well. Could be family members.
That's right. Yeah. or it could be the person that cuts you off in traffic.
Eric, thank you so much for joining us on People Soup. I really appreciate your vulnerability, your generosity in sharing what you've shared, and your wisdom. Thank you so much.
Ross, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to talk to you.
That's it, folks. The second part of my chat with Eric in the bag. Thanks to Eric for being such a generous and open guest. And remember to check out his book, The Mindful Freakout. You'll find the show notes for this episode at peoplesoup.captivate.fm or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this episode, we'd love it if you told us why. You can email me at peoplesoup.pod@gmail.com. On Twitter, we're at Ross McCoach. On Instagram, at people.soup. And on Facebook, at People Soup Pod. Folks, you can help me reach more people with the special People Soup ingredients. Stuff that could be really useful for them in work and life. So please do share, subscribe, rate and review. Thanks to Andy Glenn for his spoon magic and Alex Engelberg for his vocals. But most of all, dear listener, thanks to you. Look after yourselves, Pea Soupers, and bye for now. I have no immediate plans to come to California, but if I do, I'll certainly let you know. And similarly, I'd love to show you more of Seville.
Yeah, no, yeah. I think that's something we have to, have a pint and sit in a pub and talk about how great she was.